Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the European Club Cup once again. Now, the former five-time world chess champion Magnus Carlsen has been on a roll. He's gone 3 out of 3 for his team, the Offerspiel Shot Club from Norway, and today he's playing against one of the players who gave him a very hard time in the FIDE World Cup last August, Vincent Keymer. So let's jump right into the action. So Magnus on 3 out of 3. Now, he played Vincent in the World Cup. He won a very, very close match. Vincent also one of the top juniors in the world, someone that many people think could be a potential rival for the World Championship and compete with Magnus in the future. So Magnus gets his second white in a row. Very nice when you're at the top and you can play with 2 whites, especially when you're a player like Magnus Carlsen. So the game starts with e4 and Vincent decides to play the Sicilian defense. Now, this is definitely a little bit of a surprise in my opinion, because when you play team events, they're a little bit different than individual events. Now, what I mean by that is this is the European Chess Club Cup. So what that means is you're playing on a team of 6. So with 6 games in play and the team needing to score 3.5 points to win the match, you feel like when you look at the Novi board team, which Vincent is representing on board 1, they have big advantages on just about every single board except the top board. So normal strategy would suggest that Vincent should try to be very solid and just stabilize, draw the game, and then Novi board can win on the rest of the other boards. At any rate, Vincent decides he's going to be aggressive. So we get knight to f3, d6 being played. Now, just to clarify, Vincent has played the Sicilian, but he does play e5 most of the time, including in that game in the World Cup, which Magnus won when he was facing elimination. So it's not maybe a huge surprise, but it's surprising considering the situation of the event. So we get knight f3, d6 being played, and now Magnus plays d4. We get the swap, knight f6, knight c3, and a6 is played here. Now, this, of course, is the Najdorf system. Many people play this with white and black, and now Magnus goes bishop c4. Now, one of the drawbacks to playing the Najdorf is that there's so many different systems that white can play. Magnus, for example, in one of the recent Chess Champion Tour events against Alireza Firouzja, played this move rook to g1. You can play bishop c4, you can play bishop e3, you can play bishop g5, you can play a4, even a3 is playable. So you basically have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There are about 9 or 10 different moves that white can play in this position. As such, Magnus chooses to play bishop c4, and this is the Sozin variation where white puts this bishop on this long diagonal. Now, this was a personal favorite of the former world chess champion Bobby Fischer from the United States of America, but it's not a system that has been really in vogue in the last probably 10 or 15 years. So Vincent plays e6. We get this move a4 from Magnus. Now, this move is definitely a departure from the main lines. Normally, white plays this move bishop to b3, retreating the bishop and avoiding b5, attacking it. And many times black will play something like b5. There's also knight bd7. I remember when I was much younger, there was this line with b5 castles, b4, knight a4, and bishop to d7, which was played by the former 5-time world chess champion Vishy Anand against Dimitri Reindeer man from the Netherlands. At any rate, Magnus goes a4 here, trying to stop b5 and creating both the b3 and a2 squares for the bishop to retreat to. So Vincent plays bishop e7. We get castles, bishop to e3 played here by Magnus. A logical developing move here. You want to develop this dark square bishop so that you can bring the rooks to the center of the board. You can't go to f4 because e5 would fork the knight and the bishop. You could go to g5, but you do have to be a little bit careful about something like h6, say bishop h4, and maybe a move like knight takes e4 with some tactics here, where after takes, both queens are still under attack. Now, in this exact position, it doesn't quite work for black, but nonetheless, these ideas exist, and so Magnus decides to put the bishop on e3 instead. And now what he wants to do is very straightforward. If black ever plays b6, there always are ideas like knight b3, and now you're spying the pawn on b6. And otherwise, just as a general plan, let's say h6 is played, you can go queen e2, rook e1, and then rook d1, and perfect harmony. White has to put the rooks in the two central squares. Bishop knights are very well developed. The queen on e2 very well placed as well, and it's just a very easy free-flowing position to play for white. Now, this is one thing Magnus is very good at. It's just playing positions where the moves are pretty straightforward and easy, and the development here is very smooth. There isn't a whole lot to think about. So Vincent plays queen c7. Magnus goes queen to e2, guarding the bishop on c4, and now we get this move bishop to d7 being played here by Vincent. Now, Vincent's idea behind bishop d7 is that black is lacking some development on the queen side here. Now, the big question is, how do you develop this knight? Do you go to d7 or do you go to c6? Now, you could play knight c6 right away here, but after a move like f4 is played, white is very quickly pushing either f5 or e5. There's still rook d1 in the center of the board, and it just feels very difficult in terms of trying to finish the development. So Vincent goes bishop d7 with a different idea in mind, which is that now if white plays f4 here, there are other ideas. For example, you can play rook c8, targeting the bishop and the knight. I don't know if e5 works here. Probably it doesn't, but e5 is maybe a consideration as well, because after e5 is played, white cannot trade the knights on c6 here because you have not put your knight on the square yet. So Magnus decides here after bishop d7 to play this move a5. We get knight to g4, which is a big mistake. I was expecting knight c6 to be played here, and after knight takes, it would make sense now to have played bishop d7, because after bishop takes, now your bishop is on a nice diagonal towards the pawn at e4, which is attacking. Whereas if you didn't put the bishop on d7, say you even get this position, for example, this structure is a little bit tricky to play for black. You always have the permanent weakness. White can put the bishop on b6, say you get some position like this, just to illustrate the point. Now this a6 pawn, always weak. Rooks are going to be in the center of the board. There are ideas like e5 here. There's also f4, f5, and it's just very hard to play. So we get this a5 position played, and now Vincent plays knight g4, which is just a big surprise. Now knight g4 is a big surprise here because it blunders to me at least, a very obvious tactic. Now we can talk about the Magnus effect and people missing ideas and these sorts of things going on. But one thing that we learned from a very early age, at least the top players, when you're studying the games of the greats like Bobby Fischer, is that when you reach the Sicilians, what I call the Sozin Sicilians, with the bishop on c4 specifically, there are three ideas that white tries to come up with. One idea, just to illustrate something, and I guess let me go back a few minutes. It's easier to do it that way than anything else, but one of the most basic sacks that you see in the Sozin is where white sacks a bishop on e6 and then gets like 3 pawns here and gets a winning position out of the opening here due to the sacrifice on e6. So when you're looking at Sozins, this is one sacrifice you're always looking at. Another sacrifice that also happens a lot is, let me just put some pieces on some random squares just to illustrate the point, is that you get some position like, let's just say this, where white can go knight f5 here, sacking the knight, and after takes knight d5, suddenly white gets a lot of pressure in the center of the board for the sacrificed knight. The third one is, it's very hard to find a good illustration of it, but there are also ideas where white plays knight d5 and will just sacrifice a knight here on the square as well. So back to this game, as we get to this critical position here, you're always looking for sacks on e6, f5, or d5 with these knights and the bishop. So when Vincent plays knight g4, he simply misses this great knight sacrifice, very thematic, with knight to f5 here, attacking the bishop on e7, but also cutting off any protection of the knight on g4. Now you're probably thinking, well, white could just take on g4 right away, but after queen takes c4, black now has the 2 b's. And even though the computer thinks white is still better here after a move like queen g3 with bishop h6 ideas, it's not as easy to play. But Magnus correctly understands that after knight to f5, black's big problem is the bishop on e7, but also this bishop can go to b6, where it's guarded by the pawn and it will target the queen, and then the knight on g4 hangs immediately. So at this point, computer already thinks that white has a big advantage. Now Vincent plays bishop f6. If he were to take the free horse and accept the gambit, there's knight to d5, forking the queen and the bishop. We get queen d8, guarding the bishop, and after bishop b6, queen to e8, white has knight c7, forking the queen and the rook, and after queen c8, knight takes a8. White is simply winning here because after knight e5, bishop b3, the white knight will be able to get back to the center via the c7 and d5 squares. So we get bishop f6 played by Vincent. Magnus goes bishop b6, attacking the queen. Pawn supports the bishop. Everything here is guarded for white, and all of black's pieces are very loose. So we get queen c6 played here by Vincent, and now Magnus makes a slight mistake with this move knight d4. Now again, we're talking about games that are being played between humans, so even though you guys see the eval bar and you think that these moves are mistakes, the main line here the computer likes is a 3500 level approach that is simply not clear to us puny humans. Now if Magnus or myself were 3500, we would obviously play the best moves the computer likes, but we are not. In fact, we're not even remotely close to as good as they are. So Magnus here had the opportunity to sack the bishop with bishop to d5, attacking the queen. After pawn takes bishop, pawn takes pawn here. If black plays the move queen to c8, the only available square which doesn't hang the queen, after knight takes d6, the black queen is simply trapped. There are no squares to move the queen to. It will get captured no matter where it moves. So the only way for black to continue is to sack the queen for the knight on c3. After pawn takes queen, bishop takes f5. Black here has 3 minors for the queen, but even though black has the 3 minor pieces, after white plays move like h3, knight e5, and bishop c7, white is getting this pawn on d6, and there's g4, f4, and it's very hard for black to find any outposts for the knights or the bishops, and white should be winning. So Magnus instead plays knight d4, which is also completely reasonable. He attacks the queen here on c6. We get queen c8, bishop b3 played by Magnus. Again, does not want to trade the knight for the bishop, because in the long term the two b's can become very active, as we've seen in some of Magnus's recent games. So we get bishop b3 being played, and now Vincent plays the move knight to e5, retreating the knight. Magnus goes rook a d1. We get bishop d8, f4, kicking the knight from e5, knight c6, and now f5 is played. And here the smoke has cleared to some degree, but the problem for Vincent is that all of his pieces are so passive. First of all, the rook and the knight have not moved, but if we look at this, you'll see that black has 7 pieces on the first 2 rows. You have the 2 bishops, queen, knight, rook, and king. They're on the first 2 rows. Only knight is on the 3rd row, but black has nothing beyond these first 3 rows. There's nothing beyond the 3 rows. White has pieces on all 5 of these rows, so white has a lot more space here, and black really needs to start developing the pieces, specifically the rook and the knight, or else you're going to get crushed on the king side by this bishop on the long diagonal. A lot of pressure on e6. Now, to add insult to injury, Vincent is also getting low on time here, and he has to start making moves quickly. So Vincent decides now is the time to start trading pieces, trades the bishops, trades the knights, and plays queen to c5, attacking both the pawn on b6 and the rook on d4. Magnus plays queen to f2, breaking the pin. Important move, because if you go rook d1 after e5, spaghetti-o, your rook is pinned, and you just lose the rook, and you lose the game as well. So Magnus goes queen f2. We get e takes f5 played here after a bit of a think. Now, this is probably the last spot where Vincent could have maybe saved the game, or at least kept it going for quite a while longer with this move knight c6, because after rook to d2, black should play rook f d8 to guard the bishop against the trade of the queens. After rook f d1, we get queen f2, king f8, takes, king e7, let's just say king e3 and knight e5. And white is up a pawn here in the center of the board. White has 7 pawns versus black 6 pawns. Nonetheless, you have an outpost for the knight on e5, which is actually very reminiscent of the game yesterday between Magnus and Alexei Serrano, where Serrano was down a pawn, but he did get this outpost for the knight on the e5 square. But instead, Vincent decides to trade the pawns, and now it's very hard to play because this long diagonal is open for the light bishop. It's always scoping the king and the pawn, and you can't ever interpose with bishop e6 because I just take your bishop. As such, this white bishop becomes a super strong piece now due to the open diagonal. So Vincent plays bishop c6 here, trying to develop the knight to d7 and f6, and now Magnus plays f6. Very important move here, because if white were to waste some time with say h3 and king h2, after black gets knight f6 here, now you're blockading the pawn. You can bring the rooks to the center of the board. White has a weak pawn on b6, and additionally white also doesn't have any jumps to the center either with this bishop or knight. But Magnus plays f6 correctly here, and now Vincent plays knight d7. If Vincent were to play g6 here, white can go queen d2, and after knight to d7, king to h1, black is very close to loss here, because first of all, if you were to play rook c8, there are moves like queen to h6, setting up the classic Jean-Baptiste Wally checkmate with queen g7 on the next turn. Also, white can go rook h4 with queen h6 as well, and it's just a total disaster here for black. Now, mind you, you'll see the bar saying there are other moves that work, but it's more about the theme of what the threats are than the exact precise move, in case you're wondering why the bar goes down. So g6, queen e2, knight 7, king h1, rook c8 is possible, but here white can even play knight to d5, and after takes, rook d5, queen b6, queen h6, there's mate in 1 with queen g7. After takes, white has an extra bishop and wins the game. So Vincent plays knight d7, Magnus trades on g7, and now Vincent is really hoping that he can just bring the rooks to the center, get the king to safety, and maybe save the game. But Magnus is completely ruthless. Magnus goes bishop d5 here, an excellent move, getting rid of the one good black piece, the bishop on this long diagonal, by interposing with his bishop. Now, you're probably thinking, well, wait, but this light square bishop is really good on the diagonal. And while the bishop is very good here, what Magnus realizes is that in this position, the king is so weak. There's so many ideas here, and all of white's pieces are heading towards the king side, where the king has no protection due to the broken pawn structure with these 2 pawns on f7 and h7. So trades are not actually all that bad. So here Vincent plays f5, which is a blunder, effectively losing the game on the spot, but it's very hard to be critical here because the best line is queen takes pawn, but after bishop takes bishop, if you take with the queen, there's rook f d1 to hit the pawn, or even queen g3, winning the pawn on d6 as well. And if you take with the pawn, which is the best move, after knight to e4 here, black is supposed to play f6 here, getting rid of the slight weakness, but even this position after rook d6, queen f2, and rook f2, knight e5, knight takes f6. It's very hard to see any human saving this position for a couple of reasons. First of all, white has two sets of pawns that are connected on g2 and h2 and b2 and c2. Black has what we call 3 pawn islands. All these black pawns are split, so you have the 3 pawn islands, you're down a pawn, and you've got a weak king as well. So realistically, very unlikely that a human would save this. Now, I do think the Stockfish probably could still draw this with a black piece against Magnus, but in any human game, if a top player has the white pieces, they should win this position. So instead, Vincent plays f5. Now, Vincent also very low on time here, so he's just trying to play something, run the king back to safety, but also stop knight to e4. But Magnus trades the bishops on c6 here. We now get this move, rook fd1, an excellent move, stacking the 2 rooks. These moves, by the way, are the best moves, attacking the pawn on d6. Vincent plays queen takes pawn, hoping desperately that Magnus will take back the pawn because he's down a pawn. Why not try to even the material? And after queen f2, king f2, and knight to f6 here, white still has an advantage, but black is very much back in the game. But Magnus does not do that. Instead, he plays knight to d5 here, attacking the queen on b6, and now Vincent plays the move queen to d8. Now, it really doesn't matter where Vincent moves here. Queen takes b2 is the top computer move, but after knight to c7 here, the knight is attacking the rook. It also covers the e8 square, which means that if you move the rook to c8, there's knight to e6, forking the king and the rook. And of course, if you don't move this rook, say you go king h8, I simply take your rook in the corner and win the game due to the material advantage. So Vincent plays queen to d8 instead. Now Magnus plays knight to f4 here. And Vincent resigns the game for a couple of reasons. First of all, white is threatening the classic family fork with knight to e6, hitting the king, the rook, and the queen at the same time. And if you dodge it, which is actually quite difficult to do, I think the only way maybe to dodge it is play something like queen e8 or queen e7. If you go queen f6, there's now knight h5, forking the king and the queen. If you move the rook, there's also this fork. And if you go rook to e8, another idea, now I take the pawn, sack on d file, wins the knight or the queen, and when you guard with rook e7, I can simply go queen to d4, winning the knight on d7 due to the classic right triangle. So here Vincent resigns. I mean, queen e7 is probably the best move, but after rook takes d6, now the stack of rooks with the double stack attacks the knight. If you move the knight anywhere, there's knight e6 check, forking the king and the rook. And again, in this position here, Magnus should win this game 100 times out of 100 due to having a rook for a knight and the fact that we're in an end game. So Vincent basically sees no reason to continue, and he resigns this game after knight to f4. A resounding victory for Magnus, his 4th victory out of 4 games. He's now on a perfect score, 4 out of 4. His rating is getting a big boost. He's back up to nearly 28-48. Amazing performance, amazing consistency. Magnus is on fire, whether it's the 2500 player that he plays in the first round, whether it's a rising junior player like Vincent Keymer. Magnus is simply unstoppable right now. He is just in the zone. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of another Magnus Carlsen victory. Simply flawless stuff from him. There is a reason he's the best player in the world. Make sure to smash that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I'll be back very soon with some more great YouTube only content. See you guys. Bye.